The unsurpassed, profound, and wonderful Dharma is difficult to encounter in billions of aeons. I now see it, hear it, receive it, and uphold it, vow to fathom that its true meaning, to liberate all beings. Let's generate the supreme bodhicitta. Now let us continue with our class on the Surangama Sutra. Previously, we've already talked about the 5 great elements, including earth, water, fire, wind, and space. Today we will continue to talk about the seeing. Yesterday we covered space, so today we're going to talk about seeing, the seeing awareness, and then later we're going to talk about consciousness. The seeing awareness is similar to seeing or perceiving. According to the commentary of the right lineage, it says that the seeing elements or the seeing awareness can be considered as the roots. Our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, the 5 root consciousness perceives the external phenomena. At the time of perceiving it, the nature of it does not waver at all within the Buddha nature. It is vast without boundary. And this nature is called the seeing awareness. The consciousness mainly talks about, is mainly analyzed from the consciousness aspect. But over here, the seeing awareness doesn't only talk about what can be perceived by the eyes, rather the 6 consciousness or the 5 root consciousness according to the Buddhist logic. It is the direct perception, and this seeing awareness over here is similar to that direct perception that we talked about. From a narrow point of view, when we talk about seeing, whatever we see are true. We're talking about the seeing that's perceived by the eyes. But from more of an inclusive point of view, in fact, all the perceptions that's obtained from the 5 roots can be called seeing awareness. Because the first Bhumi Bodhisattva at the time of attaining the path of seeing, in fact, they do not only attain that through the seeing by their eyes, rather they have attained realization, and in their attainment, all of the nature of the form, sound, smell, and touch are included. Therefore, the seeing awareness is a little bit different than what we talk about usually in the narrow sense, where we only refer to the eyes. The Buddha then told Ananda, saying that Ananda, the seeing awareness does not perceive by itself. It depends upon form and emptiness for its existence. The seeing nature itself, in fact, is not knowing or feeling. Rather, it is a discriminating wisdom without a self-entity. Only by having the object of form and emptiness, our seeing nature, our seeing awareness would manifest. Itself doesn't have any entity that is everlasting. There is no such thing. Now, the Buddha continued to tell Ananda, saying that you are now in the Jeta Grove, where you see brightness in the morning and darkness in the evening. Deep in the night, you will see brightness when the moon arises and darkness when no moon is visible. The brightness and darkness are discerned by the seeing. The Buddha tells Ananda, saying that while now you are in this Jeta grove, you see light during the day and darkness at night. The light, the brightness could come from during the day, or brightness comes at night through the moon. How about darkness? Darkness is lack of light. When there is no light, then it is darkness. He first told Ananda, saying that when you're in Jeta Grove, the light during the day and the darkness at night, they're different. The brightness and darkness are discerned by seeing. How can we discern it? How can we discern the darkness and the brightness? It is through seeing. Though it seems that the seeing refers to the seeing by the eyes, so that we can see form, so that we can discern, oh, this is the day, since it's bright, or we can see something under the moonlight. Or it's darkness when you can't see anything. When you don't see anything, that is darkness. No seeing is darkness. Now let's look at these phenomena and further make analysis. Is the seeing identical in substance with brightness, darkness, and emptiness, or are they not the same substance? Our seeing has to have an object. Is it brightness, or is it darkness, or is it emptiness? Those are the three possibilities. Are these three things, brightness, darkness, and emptiness, of the same substance? Are they the same and yet different, or are they not the same and yet not different? These are the four possibilities. Over here, these particular analysis and logical inference are a bit different than the previous ones. The Buddha told Ananda, now, other than these possibilities associated with the three substances, there are no other possibilities. Previously, whenever we talk about the form, we only talked about light, dark, and emptiness. Those are the three aspects or three substances that we talk about. Those are the objects. Now, your seeing and the three objects, are they of one entity or are they of not one entity? Those are the two possibilities. Then the third one is, are they the same and yet different? Over here, it is in terms of their characteristic. The previous two questions were on whether they're of the same entity or not of the same entity, meaning if they have the same entity or different entities. The fourth question is that, or are they not the same and yet not different? This one's a bit different. This one is a little bit similar to the third question. Let's make the observation further following this logic. Let's look at what the same and different mean in different questions. Each of them are a little bit different. There are four aspects. Are they the same entity? Not the same entity? Are they the same yet different, or are they not the same and yet not different? First, the Buddha then posed this question to Ananda, saying that, Ananda, suppose seeing were one with brightness, darkness, and emptiness. If you think that this seeing awareness is of the same entity with brightness, darkness, and space, are they the same entity? I invite you also to contemplate upon it. Now, for example, you're seeing right now. Is your seeing the same entity with brightness, with darkness, and with space? Can all of them be merged into one entity? I think usually we would not say that, because the seeing as a subject, and then there's the object that is the darkness and light and brightness. If you were to think that our seeing awareness and the object that are the three can be merged into one entity, what are the faults that's associated with it? Then in such a way, the lightness and darkness will cancel each other out. If our seeing and the space as well as brightness and darkness, all the four things can be merged into one entity, then in this way, light and dark would definitely no longer be existent, because these two cancel each other out. Also, the seeing and space would also cancel out, because space is not existent. Space is not substantial, rather. I didn't cross-reference to the other commentaries, but I personally think that the commentaries by the ancient masters were much more profound. So whenever you get time, I invite you to also read and cross-reference with those. So this is the first fault that's associated with considering all of them being of one entity. Over here, the Buddha says that it so happens that where there is darkness, there is no brightness, and where there is brightness, there is no darkness, because the two cancel each other out. To further explain it, if my seeing awareness were to be merged into one entity with darkness, then at that time I will no longer be able to see brightness. Why is that? Because if brightness and darkness were to be one entity, then there would be no opportunity for me to see brightness again, since my darkness and my seeing awareness has merged into one entity, and vice versa. If my seeing awareness were to be merged with lightness, brightness, then I will no longer be able to see darkness. If you were to say that the seeing awareness has merged into one entity with all the other three things, all the four of them has merged into one entity, then that means all the other things are not separate entities. Then the next one, it says that if it were one with darkness, it would cease to exist in brightness. If we say that our seeing awareness is of the same entity with darkness, then the way of analysis is the same with the previous one. It is to say that the fault associated to it is that the brightness will completely cease, that there would be no brightness at all. That is not possible. And then if you were to say that if it were one with brightness, previously we talked about how if it were of one entity with darkness, then there would be a certain cessation of brightness. So similarly, if it were with the same entity with brightness, then it could cease to exist in darkness. brightness. Such being the case, at that time, if you were to say that it's already ceased, then if the seeing awareness has already ceased, then how could you still see brightness and darkness? That is not possible. As we are already quite aware that brightness and darkness are of different entities, they are contradictory to each other, then how could they result in two completely different results? Of course, over here, the analysis only talks about the brightness and darkness. It doesn't really make further analysis with space, but space is insubstantial. Therefore, there's no need to further compare and further to analysis the seeing awareness to space anymore. The next one over here, the Buddha says, if brightness and darkness differ from each other, how can they form unity with seeing, which transcends production and destruction? If we were to think that the brightness and darkness are of other entities, they're separate, they're completely different. The Tibetan translation is a little bit different than the Chinese translation, but I think the Tibetan version is a little bit easier to understand. What it says here is that if brightness and darkness were to be two completely different entities, then you're saying that the seeing awareness is without production or cessation, because previously we talked about how darkness and brightness, if they were separated, then the seeing awareness cannot have production or cessation. And then we talked about if darkness, brightness, seeing, awareness, and space were to be one entity. So if you were to say the previous one, then how could you say that they're of the same entity anymore? Because it violates the first principle, the previous principle that you just set up. This is the observation of the same entity. The seeing nature, the seeing awareness, brightness and darkness and space being one entity is indeed not correct, and it's not valid. Usually we would not come to agreement to that either, to that statement, that is. Suppose the essence of seeing were not of one substance with brightness and darkness, and that you were separate from the light, darkness, and emptiness. This is the second question that we talked about earlier. If you were to say that this seeing awareness is not of the same substance, the same entity with brightness, darkness, or emptiness, then the seeing nature, the seeing awareness is of an entity, the brightness in an entity, darkness in an entity, and space over here didn't specifically talk about it, specifically to talk about it, but maybe another entity as well. It is just like how the three people are of different entities, or three completely different objects are three different entities, like pillar, vase, and felt. Well, in this way, since you're already separated from light, darkness, and emptiness, then what shape and appearance would be the source of seeing have, as you distinguish it? Now, to further analyze your seeing awareness, what's the shape of it? Since whenever we talk about the seeing awareness, other than the Chittamatra school and some other schools, most of the schools only consider that the inner luminosity is a luminosity, but do not consider the phenomena being also a type of luminosity. But whatever seeing awareness, it does have connection to the phenomena, especially the conventional seeing. The conventional seeing, such as the seeing by our eyes, we talk about seeing the space. Of course, seeing the space is something that we would use as an example in Surangama Sutra, but in some other sutras, such as the Prajnaparamita Sutra, we would come to the conclusion that there's no seeing of space. But over here, it talks about how space, brightness, and darkness, if you were separate the three to be three different entities and parting from the three objects, then what is your seeing awareness looks like. The non-Buddhist schools, at the time of not tapping into the realm, the domain of any objects, then they would talk about that the consciousness is self-knowing and self-aware. I think also including our Chittamatra school, there's a certain similar feel to the philosophy, but that's a rather very special point of view. Usually, when we talk about without brightness, without darkness, and space, is there going to be a processing character associated to the seeing awareness then? I'm afraid not. But our seeing awareness definitely have some connection to the object, to the phenomena that we perceive. For example, if our object that we perceive is white, then the consciousness will also appear as white. If the object that we perceive is bright, then the consciousness would also have the brightness as the processing character. But parting from the objects, then how could there be still a processing character to your consciousness? And then the Buddha said that in the absence of darkness, brightness, and emptiness, the seeing would be the same as a hair on a tortoise or horns on a rabbit. Without the object of darkness, brightness, and emptiness, without the object, then the seeing would be just like a hair on a tortoise or horns on a rabbit, which is not existent. Last year, when we studied entering the way into great vehicle, we studied the mind-only school. There are the three branches of mind-only school: the true aspectarians, the false aspectarians, and non-aspectarians. Over here it says that without any object, the seeing awareness is just like the hair on a tortoise or the horn on a rabbit. As yogis, at the time of recognizing your own awareness, without any object, there is the self-aware and self-luminous awareness that is parted from all elaborations and extremes. This awareness is a bit different than this, but it is unfathomable. It is beyond all conception. And then in the sutra it says that how could we establish the seeing perception without the presence of the three qualities of brightness, darkness, and emptiness? From the conventional point of view, the seeing of the object, the seeing of the phenomena, without any of the objects, how can we establish a seeing of the object? Now, this is the second refutation, the refutation of them being separate entities. The third and the fourth refutation are refuted together or combined together. Then the Buddha continued to say, how could we say that the seeing was one with darkness and brightness, since brightness and darkness are opposite? Since they are contradicting to each other, then our seeing awareness would not be the same with brightness or darkness. Because in terms of the object, the brightness and darkness, they are completely different. They are opposite. When we studied Buddhist logic, we understood that they're contradicting to each other. If brightness and darkness can't be the same, then the seeing awareness that grasps onto the brightness and darkness would not be the same either. Yet, how can we say that it was different from the three qualities mentioned, since in their absence the seeing perception can never be established? Parting from the three objects, the space, brightness, and darkness, since they're already absent, how could we say that they're different? When we say that they're different, we should be able to establish, oh, this is space, that is brightness, and the other one is darkness. We should be able to separate them just as clear as this is a vase and that is pillar and the other one's a piece of felt. But without brightness, without dark, and without space, then how could you say that they are different? Because they're absent, then how could we establish that they're separate? If we cannot establish that, it is to say that we've already parted from the three. By parting from the three, they're not there. How could you say that there is a seeing to establish them again? That is not correct. That is not reasonable. The three cannot be established as one, also cannot be established as other. Now the next refutation is to refute on neither the same and neither different. How could you say that the seeing was not one with emptiness, since no boundary is established between them when they are separated from each other? Now, emptiness and seeing does not have a boundary. If we were to say that, oh, this is space, so I would draw a line between space and seeing. Also, I can draw a line between space and say this is space of this, and that part of space is the space belonging to that area. And I can also establish my seeing by drawing a line in between. I should be able to do that. However, there is no boundary to it, then how could you say that they're not the same? If they're not the same, then they should be the same. But when you look from, let it be the emptiness aspect or the seeing aspect, since there is no boundary, then how could you say that they're not the same? And if they're the same, we would say that, oh, these two people look similar. And then these two people, since they look the same, there should be, when there comes to a third person, and then we would say that, oh, the third person doesn't look like the other person. We could say that, but if the two people do not establish, then how could we establish the third person to say that it looks like the other one or not? Similarly, we need to have two objects to say whether they're alike or not, because we need them as a reference. We need one person as a reference. For example, if you were to say that, oh, Khenpo looks like Khenpo himself, there's no way of saying that. We have to have two things to say if they look like each other or not. But over here, if both of them are not, cannot be established, then you can't say that they're the same. The next refutation is, how could we say that they were not different, since the seeing always remains unchanged regardless of whether it perceives the brightness or darkness? Let it be seeing the brightness or the darkness, there's the changes of the perception, but the seeing awareness does not change. The Tibetan translation is a little bit different in translation. Not sure if it's a wrong translation or if the Tibetan version is a correct translation. But the Chinese translation I think is correct, where it says that the previous ones are different and not different, same and not the same, because all the other ones have already been refuted. Over here, since it is not different, means there's no difference. If seeing and brightness are impermanent, and if mind is not changing, then how could there be difference? What it means is that though there is the seeing of brightness and seeing of darkness, but since the mind does not change, then how could there be a difference? We can refute the seeing in such a way. And then the Buddha further told Ananda by saying that you should examine this in even greater detail, investigate it minutely, consider and contemplate it carefully. The Tibetan version translated as you should again and again examine it in greater and greater detail. Do not consider it only in a vague way or a coarse way. Rather, you should delve into this examination with profound wisdom, with very subtle wisdom. Then you would be able to understand it. Maybe because this part is really important, therefore the Buddha emphasized on this again and again. In the sutra, we often would read that the Buddha would say that listen, contemplate or think again and again, good and good. So there are some repetitions of those words in order to emphasize. Maybe in Sanskrit it is one word, but it is to make a repetition in translation so that we would be able to get the intensity of the particular context. The Buddha continued to say that the light comes from the sun and darkness from absence of the moon. Penetrated belongs to emptiness, and solidity returns to the earth. So we've already talked about the four different aspects: the light and darkness, and the penetration as well as solidity. Solidity means blockage, and penetration over here means without blockage. So those are the four aspects that we referred to earlier as well. From what does the essence of seeing arise? After making such observation, our seeing essence rely on the object, but the object doesn't have any solid existent entity. Then how does it arise? The Buddha then continued to say that seeing has awareness, and emptiness is inanimate. They do not mix and unite. Nor can it be that the essence of seeing arises spontaneously without an origin. Over here it says that the seeing has the awareness which is empty, also extinction. In the Tibetan translation, instead of inanimate, it means it's cessation or extinction. The seeing and awareness and emptiness and cessation. Not sure if the emptiness here refers to space, because previously it also talks about mixing and uniting of the two things that cannot be mixed and united. Therefore, it is called neither can be united or mixed. So the Buddha says that your seeing awareness arises without causes and conditions, nor spontaneity, nor is it arose from spontaneity. Previously, we have already refuted the production from causes and conditions, and then later from spontaneity. So we can see that the seeing essence is not a production from causes and conditions nor spontaneity, therefore it is simply beyond our conception. And then the Buddha continued to say that if the faculties of seeing, hearing, and knowing are by nature all pervasive and unmoving, we talked about how the Buddha nature is not only part of the mind continuum of all the sentient beings, rather it is connected and it is all within the water, fire, and all the elements as well. Therefore, we don't even need to mention about our seeing essence. All the seeing, hearing, awareness, and knowing are part of the perfect Dharmadhatu as well, without any movements and all pervasive. Since the nature of it is unmoving, but in terms of its manifestation, we still perceive movements. That is how you can see light, and sometimes you don't see brightness anymore, you only see darkness. And then the Buddha continued to say that you should know that the stable, boundless emptiness together with the unstable elements such as earth, water, fire, and wind all together known as the six elements. They are in nature true and perfectly fused, and thus are the treasury of the thus come one fundamentally devoid of production and destruction. The nature of the seeing, hearing, awareness, and knowing, they are also stable and not moving. The nature of them is without movement, but the appearance, it manifests as it is moving. In fact, what is stable and unmoving, including all the elements as well, the earth, water, fire, and wind, I think the Surangama Sutra is indeed very profound. Let it be the elements and the space. And today we talked about the seeing essence. The Surangama Sutra points to how they are all stable within the Buddha nature. They are without production and without cessation. That's the nature of it. In the wish-fulfilling treasury, as well as arresting the mind, the Venerable Longchenpa also talks about the alaya, the fundamental alaya, or the true meaning alaya, where it talks about the true nature of Buddha nature. Indeed, it's not just only, it doesn't only refer to the mind continuum of all the sentient beings. Indeed, the animate world and the inanimate world both uphold the nature of the Tadagaregarbha. It is only after the maturation of alaya the inanimate world would manifest, but that's very profound. So the next part, the Buddha continued to say that Ananda, your nature is so submerged that you have not realized that your seeing, hearing, awareness, and knowing are basically the treasury of the thus come one. You should contemplate the seeing, hearing, awareness, and knowing to see whether they are subject to production and extinction. This is really a direct pointing out to Ananda, and Ananda probably at that time is on the brink of attaining enlightenment. And at that time, at the brink of attaining enlightenment, usually there's more of obstacles. So the Buddha is being very strict to him, saying that Ananda, your nature is already submerged and you have not realized your seeing yet. Now you think now you should also follow the direct pointing out by the Buddha to look at your seeing, hearing, your awareness, and knowing, as well as earth, water, fire, and wind. Whatever you hear, whatever you look, whatever you think, and all the objects are in front of your six roots. All the seeing, hearing, and knowing and awareness, are they identical or different? Are they subject to production and extinction? Are they identical or are they different? You can make the observation of those. Master Wenlin and Master Oyi come to the conclusion that all the seeing, hearing, and knowing awareness, all the production and cessation, and all the identical and different, in fact, are the elaborations. If we can part from these elaborations, then we would be able to know the nature of this Tathagata. We would be able to come to the realization of the Tathagata. So we can make the same observation. What you're thinking, what you're hearing, what you're smelling, what you're touching, and whatever you're seeing, are those things with production and cessation, or without production and without cessation? Are they the same with the others or not the same with the others? Are they of the same entity, or are they of the other? Are they of other entities? You can make such observation. In the Ati teachings, we would keep looking at where your mind is, what happened to your mind. So we need to look inward and we look inside. Otherwise, there's no cure for our illness of grasping, of our solid grasping, because we've already received such wonderful Dharma teachings and wonderful gurus and have received the direct pointing out. If we do not look inwardly, even if the Buddha directly come to ask us the questions and directly give us the pointing out instructions, if we don't do that, if we don't make that observation ourselves, then we would not be able to come to the realization of it. But if we can make the observation of looking at the production and cessation of the mind, and what the mind is actually in nature, and what's the nature of our seeing, hearing, and awareness and knowing, is there really production and cessation? Is there any shapes and colors? If we were to look inwardly and look at our own mind, then the sharp faculty practitioners would be able to see that this dualistic thought that we have at that moment, which is clear, luminous, but the nature is just luminous and emptiness. Other than that, there's nothing else to be there. And of course, there's no word to describe it either. And then the Buddha continued to say that you still do not know that in the treasury of the thus come one, the nature of seeing is enlightened brightness. When we were studying the flight of the Garuda and the wish-fulfilling treasury, and the treasury of the Dharmadhatu, though I am not an enlightened one, but by the blessings of the great Venerable Longchenpa and the great masters of the past, I believe many of us have already come to some kind of insight and understanding of the coming and going of the mind. So over here, the Buddha asked Ananda, well, it is only that you do not know that the seeing, hearing, and awareness and knowing, in fact, is simply the enlightened brightness. It's just the luminosity and the wondrous function of the Tathagata, and the nature of such, the essence of enlightenment is bright seeing. Pure at its origin, it pervades the Dharma Dhatu. Each of us, the sentient beings, we already have Buddha nature. We already have that. That is why all of us can come to the full realization, the enlightenment. We have such resource. We have such opportunities. And then the Buddha continued to say that it accords with the living beings' minds in response to their capacity to know. Because of the capacities different, for example, the Buddha would be able to perceive all the pure lands of the 10 directions without any obscuration. The Bodhisattvas would be able to perceive the worlds of hundreds of millions of worlds, according to the Bodhisattva Charyavatara as well as the Sutra of the 10 Bhumis. The Shravakas and Pradika Buddhas would be able to see the whole of Jambudvipa, just like one looks at the mango fruit in one's palm. Ananda, since he attained the first dhyana, therefore he has the insights of that level. For mundane beings, we are very short-sighted, therefore we only see a tiny bit with our dualistic mind and with our conception as well as reasoning and logical analysis. So our seeing is very narrow. We should understand that. And then the Buddha continues to say that consider, for example, the sense organ of seeing. Its seeing pervades the Dharma realm. The same is true of the luster of the wonderful virtue of hearing, smelling, tasting, contact, and knowing. Since they feel emptiness in the 10 directions throughout the Dharma realm, how could there be any fixed location in which they are found? Let it be the hearing, let it be the tasting and touching and the feelings, as well as awareness. In fact, the luster of the wonderful virtue of all of them is without any obscuration. It is all pervasive throughout the Dharma realm. Sometimes when we enter into a toilet, we feel that the smell is really foul, but in the luminosity of such in the Buddha nature, it is no other than the pure Buddha fields. It simply appears and manifests in front of us, the sentient beings, to be of a foul smell. Or it could also apply to really bad music or some terrible feeling of touch and so on. Sometimes during an empowerment, the volunteers would specifically give you the rough textured things for you to feel. That is also a direct way, direct pointing out, a method of direct pointing out. And then the Buddha said that it is all pervasive throughout the 10 directions, and how could there be any fixed location in which they're found? All of the resources of all the seeing, hearing, and awareness as well as knowing are all pervasive. It is experienced to whatever extent is dictated by the law of karma. Well, I believe whomsoever are all of you who are sitting here, you have accumulated the good karma to receive great empowerments, and if you can keep your if you can keep pure precepts and your vows, also practice confession till the time you die, then your life would be meaningful. The time you gain as a human body, the time you have gained as a human would be very meaningful. Therefore, that's the kind of practice you need to engage in. Ignorant of this fact, people in the world are so deluded as to assign its origin to causes and conditions or to spontaneity. These mistakes, which arise from discrimination and the reasoning process of the conscious mind, are nothing but a play of empty words which have no real meaning. So over here it covers the seeing essence or the seeing awareness. But within the seeing, we in fact talked about the seeing, hearing, awareness, and knowing. Seeing is so correlated to the Buddha nature that it cannot be separated from Buddha nature. It is really up to us, the sentient beings, based on our own capacity to understand. I think the capacity of all of us definitely varies. Let it be high or low. I'm sure some of you would have great wisdom and great compassion. We have very different capacities, and that is very much related to our mind and the capacity we can understand.